All right. Welcome to another morning episode of the Liberty Dad podcast, a discussion on politics and culture. If you're tuning in live, I want to especially thank you for giving me your time so early. Now, you might have just noticed, like, hey, wait a minute. Where is the quote? Normally, you start out the episode with a quote. Well, normally, I'm a little bit more prepared. And so I was running behind this morning, and it was further made behind by me trying to compile the information for today. And I've been actually working on it for a couple of days. There is so much information here, and it's hard to try to sometimes figure out how to distill it down to a simple episode, especially one that's not like droning on and on. Nobody wants to hear that, right? So we want to kind of like get to the point, hear what we have, what we can learn, and then move forward. But what happens is sometimes I like to go and read old documents, especially when we're talking about new things that have existed for a long time, or things that have dramatically changed. I like to go back and I look at what we used to, how we used to think of things, and that kind of gives me some insight into how we're doing it today. And it's not a matter of, well, that's the way that we had always done it, so therefore we need to keep doing it that way. It's more like, what has changed, and is that a good change, right? Or maybe there's something that hasn't changed, and we've just kind of made it look like it's changed. So sometimes I go back and for various reasons, I like to go back and I read things, and sometimes I get caught up in reading them, and I'm like, okay, well, there's a wealth of information here. So I actually have a wealth of information here today, and it's going to be it's interesting, and I hope that I was able to compile it in a way that makes sense. But we will see if I was able to accomplish that or not. Setting up a couple last minute things here, just as we get going on. All right. So I dug up some interesting information. So let's start first and foremost with, what are we talking about today? We are talking about defining slurs. Now, you might have look, I don't really like following other podcasters and like doing shows on their shows. That's just not my thing. Other people do. They do that. They have a version, sometimes people critique, whatever. Like, there's different reasons that you might kind of follow other people and then do shows about their shows. And that's fine. I have no issue with that. I just generally try to avoid it personally. I like to kind of keep it as fresh as possible. But I think this is a value add to talk about. So recently, Candace Owens, she threw down the gauntlet and she challenged Ben Shapiro to a debate. So let's go ahead and put her challenge up on the screen so that we can see that here. All right. So there it is. And what she's saying here, for anybody that's listening and maybe not looking at the screen, Oops, that was mine. Hold on. Let me hold on. That's there we go. How about that one? She says, I would like to debate Ben Shapiro on Israel and the current definition of anti Semitism. Can somebody make that happen? And then there was like a whole bunch of tweets back and forth between her and Ben Shapiro. And then was it Jeremy Boring, who I think he's like, he runs the Daily Wire or whatnot, manages it. So there was these kind of tweets going back and forth, and it looks like it might happen. I haven't checked lately to see what's going on, but the last I saw, Ben agreed, but then it was a matter of what conditions would each agree upon. And so we'll see if that ends up happening. But what I tweeted, I retweeted that, and then I said, I hope real Candace, I hope Candace points out anti-Semitism has the same definitional issue of racism as racism, control by a select group exempt from challenge. In her talk with Rabbi Barclay, he limits defining to Jews, specifically intelligentsia, and negatively labels dissenting Jews. And I gave an example of comic Dave Smith. Dave Smith. Sorry, I'm reading his Twitter handle. So this is the genesis of the show today. Is like, hey, defining slurs. How do we define this? What's a proper way? And let's put some context around what she's talking about, so that it makes a little bit more sense before we kind of really dive in deep here. So the current working there is literally something called the working definition of anti-Semitism, and that comes from the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. So I'm going to put that up on the screen so that you can see that as well, and then we will walk through it here real quickly. So let's see. There you go. Right there we go. All right, so here it is. Working definition of anti-Semitism. And we'll skip down to the parts where it's kind of a long definition. We're not going to go through the whole thing. In a previous episode, I did kind of skip through it a little bit. But we're going to go down here. So it says on 26 May 2016, the plenary in Bucharest decided to adopt the following non-legally binding working definition of anti-Semitism. And here is that definition. Anti-Semitism is a certain perception of Jews, which may be expressed as hatred toward Jews. Rhetorical and physical manifestations of anti-Semitism are directed toward Jewish or non-Jewish individuals and or their property, toward Jewish community institutions and religious facilities. Now, that's not a very clear definition, in my opinion. That is extremely broad. And think of it this way. Imagine that I went out on the street. You know the man on the street videos where somebody goes out and they're like, "Hey man, can you tell me the names of all the Supreme Court justices?" And then people are like, Kobe Bryant, right? And they say something weird, and then we all have a laugh at them. I want you to think about that for a second. People have trouble understand, like people don't even know some of this information that we might think is basic. Like, shouldn't you know at least a few names of the members of the Supreme Court? Right? Shouldn't you know? You should know who the president is. There's been questions like, do you know who the president is? And people are like, no, I don't. Or they try to make up something, right? So there's all these basic questions that people seem to fail at. I bet that if I went and did a man on the street and I said, here's the definition of anti Semitism, and I told it to them, or I read it to them, I read it to them, or I gave it to them for them to read, I'm willing to bet that most people wouldn't really know what this means. They would it wouldn't be clear to them. And I bet I could give some different examples and they wouldn't be able to conclusively tell me, "Oh, that example that you just gave definitely falls under this definition." And I think that's a problem right off the bat, because how can people know what are the guidelines, if you will, for appropriateness? And like, how do we know, okay, this is okay, but this is not okay? So let me reference something else here really quickly. Back in one of my other episodes, I was talking. I played Martin Luther King Jr.'s speech, "The Other America." I think it's from 1967, And I reference this a lot when I talk about the definition of racism, because the definition of racism, as we'll see, has been redefined. But the definition of racism once upon a time was actually pretty simple and easily understood. So in his speech, The Other America, Dr. Martin Luther King, he's talking about racism. And he starts, and I'm not going to read the whole excerpt here, but he starts and he's like, in the final analysis, racism is evil because its ultimate logic is genocide. Hitler was a sick and tragic man who carried racism to its logical conclusion. He ended up leading a nation to the point of killing about 6 million Jews, right? So he's clearly understood what what is the end result of racism. It doesn't matter that one person may be racist and say, "Well, I would never do that." What he's saying is when you carry it to the logical conclusion, this is what happens. And so it says, this is the tragedy of racism because its ultimate logic is genocide. If one says that I am not good enough to live next door to him, if one says that I am not good enough to eat at a lunch counter or to have a good, decent job or to go to school with him merely because of my race, he is saying consciously and or unconsciously that I do not deserve to exist. I agree. I think that's a fair assessment of what racism is. So then he goes on. This is the very important part. He says, to use a philosophical analogy, racism is not based on some empirical generalization. It is based rather on an ontological affirmation. It is not the assertion that certain people are behind culturally or otherwise because of environmental conditions. It it is the affirmation that that the very being of a people is inferior, and this is the great tragedy of it. So I want you to think about that for a second. He tells you two things here. He tells you what it is and what it is not. And I reference this all the time because today, when we have these kind of slurs, when we say this is racist, this is transphobic, this is anti-Semitic, they all fall within, they all fail for the same reasons. They have vague definitions that are very broad and cover a lot of people. And those who promote those definitions rarely, if ever, tell us, okay, here's how you can criticize this group of people without falling into being a bigot. This is how you do it. These are the kind of things that you would be able to say and not be a bad person. But they don't do that. And because they can't, because the definitions are so broad that that they cover pretty much any criticism of somebody. But here, Dr. King has clearly pointed out that there is a way for which you could criticize. He doesn't explicitly say it, but there is a manner under which you could criticize the Black community, and it would not be racist. He said, it is not the assertion that certain people are behind culturally or otherwise because of environmental conditions. So if I were to say something like the Black community is largely illiterate, right? I'm not making that claim, but let's just say I was. And then I would further say, and someone were to ask me, well, why are they illiterate? And I might say, well, they are largely illiterate because they have not received proper education, right? So this is an environmental condition, a condition that we could change. This is not about their being. This is about where are a group of people right now and why are they in this particular position. And that leaves an opportunity, a proper opportunity for anybody to criticize somebody in the Black community. But it also kind of distinguishes it from where that criticism crosses the line into racism, right? And he says it is the affirmation that the very being of a people is inferior. So let's put this into context. Um, I remember reading, and I wish I could find the source, but I remember reading a long, long time ago that when Jewish people started coming to the United States, there was this attitude that they weren't very high IQ. And that was because they took an IQ test and they were failing them. They weren't doing so well. Well, as it turned out, a lot of them, they didn't speak English, or they didn't speak English very well. So they, of course, weren't going to do very well on these IQ tests. So it gave people this kind of impression that they were low IQ. And then it turned out, once they, either had the test in their native language, or the test were, they came along and understood English a lot better, then they started doing much better on their test, right? So you have two directions that you could go in this. You could say, based on those tests, that, oh man, I guess they're just very low IQ people, and that's just who they are. Okay. That would be a bigoted statement, because you're describing a situation as being part of their being, as opposed to saying, oh, turns out you're not doing so well because this is not your native language that you're used to. So you don't fully understand what test you're taking. You don't understand the questions. And so therefore you can't give the best answer that you would be capable of giving. Right. So that would be an environmental condition. Like, oh, the environmental condition is we gave you a test that was not in the language that you're familiar with. It's pretty simple. If you give me a test in Spanish, I'm going to fail it spectacularly. Right. So this definition, in a sense, it's not really a formal definition that Dr. King gave us, but it does kind of help us separate when somebody is being a bigot and when they are simply describing something that could be changed. Okay, so this is the issue that I have with a lot of these. And if you look at any one of the buzz slurs out there, racism, homophobia, transphobia, anti-Semitism, any of these, and you start looking, you start talking to people, the people that are really pushing these notions, like, oh, there's so much transphobia. You start asking, well, will you define transphobia? You'll notice that their definition tends to be broad. It may not be a formal definition, but however they define it, it is almost always broad. And it kind of is like that big, huge net that catches everyone, rather than nailing it down to those who are describing something based on their being, not, the circumstances at the time. So this is a background for kind of laying the foundation here for talking about this definition. And again, let's read it. Anti-Semitism is a certain perception of Jews. What does that mean? A certain perception. Like, what perception exactly? Which may be expressed as hatred toward Jews. Okay, so now we're defining this. We're saying, like, this thing is hatred toward Jews, but we're unclear of what it is that is the perception of it. And I don't think that you can logically look at this and say, well, certain perception, like, what does that actually mean? And how do we know that it manifests itself in, it's expressed as the hatred toward Jews? Because if you don't know what the perception is, if you don't know the origin, then how do you know how, it's kind of like working backwards. It's like saying, well, I didn't like what you were saying. That's an expression of hatred. And it's because you have this perception of Jews, rather than looking back and saying, okay, what is the origin of what you're saying? Why are you saying that? Rhetorical and physical manifestations of anti Semitism are directed toward Jewish or non Jewish individuals. What they mean by that is, if I perceive somebody to be Jewish, right, then I might make a comment to them. And even though I'm wrong, because maybe the person isn't Jewish, but I might think that they're Jewish, right? So I might say something, very negative toward them about being a Jew, and or their property toward Jewish community institutions and religious facilities. Okay, so again, it's just saying, like, you're directing it, and it's just this very open definition that isn't as clear what it means. Now, I will say that you go down here and it says manifestations might include the targeting of the state of Israel conceived as a Jewish collectivity. Okay, so that's starting to make a little bit more sense. And what's interesting is it starts off by talking about the state of Israel, right? So now we've kind of moved from Jews to the state of Israel. And remember, the state of Israel is a government, which we're going to talk about here in a second. Then it goes on, it says, however, criticism of Israel, similar to that leveled against any other country, cannot be regarded as anti-Semitic. So now that might sound like, oh, okay, well, that's fine. Now we know that there are some definitions. There are some criticisms that people could make of Israel that are not anti-Semitic. But if you look at the state of politics today, that would actually seem to not be true. And I think it's because, again, these definitions like are very vague. They're not saying, oh, okay, well, this is what it would mean to be anti-Semitic, and this is what it would not mean, like Dr. King did a moment ago. All right. And what's even more interesting is this statement here is actually in itself kind of vague. I want you to think about it for a minute. It says criticism of Israel similar to that leveled against any other country. But what other country exists similarly to Israel with Palestine? So you think you got Israel, you've got Palestine right next door. Palestine is full of Hamas people, right? Hamas terrorists who would love to destroy Israel altogether. And then you've got a mix of Palestinians who some do support Hamas and some may not, and or don't. Like I think it's pretty much factual that some of them simply do not. They just don't have a choice but to live there and to operate in the situation that they're in. So, how many states, how many governments, entities, countries are in a situation like that? How many countries similar to Israel had an attack that killed like 1,200 people? Well, like none of them. So it's kind of vague here because anytime you might say, like, if I were to say, well, I would criticize Germany if they did that same thing. Well, Germany's not like them, right? Germany isn't, Germany is not similar because their neighbors aren't doing that, right? And so it makes, I think, even this definition, I mean, not definition, but this statement here, it allows for people to kind of brush off the criticism by simply saying, well, that's not the same. They're not the same. And if you've ever argued with people and tried to use like an analogy or a comparison, people love to pick it apart and they're like, well, that's not exactly true. Because they really look for one-to-one comparisons. So people really aren't even good at actually making an analogy, to kind of highlight a particular point because they're busy looking at they're looking for a one-to-one comparison. And when they don't find a one-to-one comparison, the first thing they say is, yeah, that's different. Same thing here, right? Oh, well, that's different. Germany's different. The US is different. And it's unfortunate because there are a lot of people, libertarians necessarily, who would criticize virtually every government all over the place, right? So we are at least one group of people that would be consistent in applying our criticisms from one government to the next. But again, somebody could simply come along and say, yeah, but that's not the same because Israel's different than all these other countries that you've criticized. And so that's part of this problem with this definition is that it's just open. It's just open there. So what I want to do now is, let me see, let me check on my screens here. So what I want to do is I want to pull up a clip of Candace Owens talking to Rabbi Barclay. Now I've played these in past episodes, but I'll play them again so we can start talking about this anti-Semitism, and then we're going to kind of like tie it into some of these other definitions, these other slurs and stuff like that. And before I get too far along here, I throw a comment up on the screen. Time surfing alien, good morning to you, sir or ma'am. Not really sure which one, but good morning to you. Thank you for joining. So let's move along. Let's play this clip from Candace Owens. And I'm actually going to play two clips, and I think they're both about 2.5 minutes each. So we'll play one, and then we'll play the next. If you don't know where this comes from, Candace Owens, a man named Rabbi Barclay had written a scathing article about Candace Owens. And Candace was like, hey, you know what? Let's bring him on the show and let's talk about my article. And in there, or his article, criticizing me. And so then she brought him on, and part of that touched upon the definition of anti-Semitism. So let's play that and see what we hear.
For me personally, if I thought that racism could just be an ever-shifting definition based on the experience of Black people, it would be a remarkable power, and I would be able to create something like BLM, which could say that everything was racist. So I am not going to be able to agree that definition should be able to transform according to what's happening during the day. But
Okay, so I want to pause it there for a moment. So what she's talking about is Rabbi Barclay had said, "Hey, once upon a time, anti-Semitism was manifested in this way, but then it got manifested in this way, and now it's manifested in this new way." And I think he explains it in one of these two clips. So I'm not gonna, but that's basically what they're talking about. Is he's saying that the definition of anti-Semitism has shifted over many years, and that's what makes it so insidious. And in his claim is that anti-Semitism, unlike any other kind of bigotry, is very, very unique. And I think he calls it a unique hatred.
here's what I will say. If you could, just because I think it's really important for us to get to going through this article, because then you might be able to explain why you view it as anti Semitism. If you could just give us what you are saying the current definition of anti Semitism is today, that would be very helpful.
The current definition of anti Semitism today has to do with what the feelings are. It has to do with anti Zionism, number one.
Okay, so let's pause right there. So he said anti-Zionism. Okay, now if I don't have a specific definition of anti-Zionism, but this has to do with the state of Israel. Okay, so that's what he's talking. So he says, I didn't say it. He said it. Number one, it has to do with Israel, right? Not the feelings of Jews in general, Israel. So let's continue because that's going to be important. So let's just note that.
That is a definition. Anti-Zionism, anti-Israel is anti-Semitism.
Okay.
This isn't
so you believe that Jewish people can be anti-Semitic?
Absolutely.
Okay. So when you see a gathering of Jewish people who say, I'm Jewish, but I don't support Israel or Bibi Netanyahu, you say that person can be anti-Semitic.
You just did two different things and was very you just did two different things that were totally unrelated, Candace.
Okay.
You said that Jews that do not support Israel.
Yes.
And you said Jews that do not support Bibi Netanyahu.
I'm just saying that because he's the current prime minister. So I'm saying like if they say I don't support.
No, this is where you're missing the point.
Okay, so let's pause this for a second. So he's now splitting hairs. He's like, okay, well, you just did two things, and these two things are entirely different. You're talking about the state of Israel and you're talking about the prime minister. Now, remember, a moment ago, we just said that the definition of we just said that the definition of anti-Zionism, according to the Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, claimed that criticism of Israel similar to that leveled against any other country cannot be regarded as anti-Semitic. So, in other words, what you do to another country, you can do, what criticism you can level at one country, you can level at Israel, right? And that's what she did. She said, look, Bibi Netanyahu, he is the prime minister of Israel. Therefore, if somebody were to have criticism of him, or Israel, and then the rabbi says, no, those are two entirely different things. Except for, think about in the United States. How often do people criticize the United States president and also the policies of the government, right? In the same sentence, kind of as the same. We treat him as the same. We're like, oh, okay, well, right now it's President Biden. So President Biden gets to wear, if you will, he gets to bear on his shoulders the policies of the United States. And a lot of times they are effectively interchangeable, and they're interchangeable. Doesn't matter which president they are. When it was Donald Trump and all these bad U.S. policies. And it doesn't matter that the policies may be similar from president to president in some ways. It just is simply that because he's the president, because our president is so closely linked to the policies of our country, that when you say Trump or Biden or George W. Bush or whomever, when you criticize them and you criticize our policies in the same breath, nobody like people generally don't want to say, okay, well, you need to make a distinction between the United States and President Biden. That just doesn't happen. So already, remember, I said criticism of Israel similar to that leveled against any other country cannot be regarded as anti-Semitic. Well, and I said this allows people to kind of split hairs. That's exactly what he just did. He literally just split hairs and said, no, no, you can't do that. Well, wait a minute. Can we treat Israel the same as we treat the United States, Germany, Great Britain, so on and so forth, or can we not? And this is where we're seeing the problem with with the definition. So let's continue on.
I'm going to go under the following premise. Okay. I'm going to go under the premise that you care about people. You and I don't know each other, but I'm going to go under that premise. I'm going to go under the premise that you have no desire to ever hurt anyone.
Okay, so I think he's just buttering her up here, like in my opinion. But hey, whatever. I mean, it's a conversation. That's how things go.
Okay. That's the
I think her
premise I'm
face.
coming into
I think her face shows it when if you look at it, and she's like, yeah, I see what you're doing.
this dialogue with.
My opinion.
You have been devastatingly hurtful. And I think that I'm going to go from that you don't understand what it means to the Jewish world.
Okay, so it's very interesting because he's like, you just did two things. And then he kind of like buttering her up. He's like, look, I'm going to say that you probably don't want to hurt anybody's feelings. You don't want to be this kind of a person. You want to be a good person, right? Yes, I do. And then he says, but you did something very hurtful, right? That's very manipulative. But more importantly, he didn't at all explain what it was that, why is this different? Why are two things, Israel and Netanyahu, why are they separate? Why must they be treated separate? He doesn't do that because these definitions don't allow for it, right? So you have to kind of go in some other path and say, okay, well, now let me get into some more emotional manipulation.
There's a great teaching that comes out of every sociologist, every person in academics, is that I don't get to tell a black man if he's experiencing racism. He knows. I don't get to tell you if you're experiencing misogyny. You know. If I make a comment and it's misogynistic, and you say, Rabbi, that was really misogynistic, my job is to say, wow, I didn't mean that. I apologize. That's not what I meant. And you do not get the right to say what is anti-Semitic or Jew hatred.
Okay, so that's the end of that first clip. So let's put this out into a different context. So let's get it out away from something that is so charged and heavy. Okay, so imagine that I come home and my wife has been having a bad day, and she, like she sees something that maybe I didn't do, and she's kind of getting sharp with me, and she's like, "Well, you need to do this." And I'm like, man, why is she so angry today? And, and I don't know why she's angry yet, right? Like maybe she's just, decided to be mean, or maybe she's having a bad day, or many other things, right? But I don't know yet. So then I come in, I come in the house maybe, and she's upset and she's kind of getting sharp with me. And then she's like, and this and this and this and this. And then I'm like, wow, I might say something really terse and mean, like, is it that time of the month? Right. And so now I'm kind of being sexist, right? Like I'm just like, oh, well, you're clearly angry because you're just being a woman. Right. And so she could say, well, that's very hurtful to me. But the question is, was that my intent to be hurtful, or was I just being stupid and not picking out something else? Right. Not ascribing it to something else. Like you might think of it as I was being lazy, right? Because it doesn't necessarily, like, the real question is that my actual feeling toward her? Or was I just reaching for the first thing that came to mind? Right. And in our society, it's very common, unfortunately, that when a woman is angry, we kind of reach for that. And so I think the problem here is that feelings can lie, right? She felt like, hey, he's being a sexist. And maybe I was, right? Maybe that comment was. But then what we tend to do is we focus on that, what was being said, as opposed to what underlies it, right? And maybe a better example would be to skip away from a very specific and just say, like, I could be mad at my friend one day, very angry, and I might want to punch him in the head, right? Like, man, he said something very mean, and my feelings might lie to me, because maybe I'm mad at him and I don't realize something that would temper my anger, right? And so back to my story, maybe we can clean it up a little bit. I don't think it was a good story. I was trying off the fly. I was trying to make something up off the fly, and I don't think I picked a really good one, but we're gonna work with it. Let's try to clean it up. So imagine in that same scenario, I come home. I've been having a bad day too, right? And so then I respond sharply to her. She's been having a bad day. I've been having a bad day, which is common. Like husband and wives come home, and sometimes both of them have had a rough day. And so one person gets sharp, says something to the other person gets mad at that person, right? And we think the person did it intentionally. You intentionally said that because you're a sexist, because you're this, because you don't like whatever, right? And we have these kind of breakdowns of communication. And these are normal. And I don't mean normal in the sense like they're okay. I just mean normal that they happen, and they happen a lot in different ways. And so in this scenario, and again, I'm trying to clean this up a little bit so it makes a little bit more sense. In this scenario, um, I now have found some offense. She has found an offense. We're kind of going back and forth, and we're mad at each other. And the reality is that neither one of us stopped long enough to figure out what it is that was driving what they said. Was the driver actually something bigoted, or was it that they were just in a bad mood and they reached for something to be hurtful, right? And this is my problem here with what he's like, well, you don't get to tell somebody, what is anti-Semitic. I don't get to tell somebody what is racist or what is misogynistic. And, with that they're experiencing. No, you don't. Feelings are feelings, but that doesn't mean that we can't challenge feelings and say, there's other information that might temper how you feel about this situation. No, I wasn't just saying that because I don't like women. I was having a bad day and I just looked for something to say that was hurtful because you said something hurtful to me first, right? You were criticizing me for this. I wasn't in the mood for it. So I reached for something that wasn't very pleasant and I said that back to you, right? Which is like, again, that's not a good thing, but the human experience is nuanced like that. People say things that they don't mean all the time. But when we have these kind of rigid rules, you don't get to tell somebody what they're experiencing is sexist or racist, right? When we have these rigid rules that allow for the person that's been the aggrieved person to label the entire situation with no pushback, then what that means is the nuance of where somebody's coming from is excluded entirely. And that nuance could be that they're angry. It could be that they're ignorant, right? They may have a limited view of things. And with a little bit broader view, they would come to a realization that what they're saying doesn't make any sense. So I'll give you one more example, which I think is going to work. When I was a youth director years and years ago, I worked with some kids, and most of like virtually all the kids were white kids, and they lived on a poor. There's like a particular street, we called it the 11th Street, and that was the name of the street, 11th Street. But there was a lot of poor people on that street, and one of the kids was expressing some very negative thoughts regarding Mexicans, and I was like, "Why are you so? Why are you so bitter against Mexicans?" He's like, "Because I see them dealing drugs and ruining my street." And I'm like, "Okay, well, are those the only ones you see?" And he's like, "Well, yeah." And I was like, "Okay, well, are you aware that there's plenty of Mexicans who are very productive members of society and they're not, the gangbanger type that you're seeing?" And it's like he wasn't aware of this, right? Like this was his view. His view was very, very limited. And so he had this bigoted attitude toward all Mexicans because his only view of Mexicans was these bad guys that were dealing drugs and carrying around guns and threatening people. right? Like that was his view. And so he felt what he felt based on ignorance. And that's what gets left out when we tell people you don't get to say, no, we don't get to say how people feel. I feel how I feel. And like you can't take that away. But that doesn't mean that you can't occasionally, in an appropriate manner at the appropriate time, challenge it and say, okay, well, let's talk about it. Let's talk about why you felt that way and whether or not your feelings were accurate had an accurate sense of the situation at the time. So again, these scenarios we're talking about, you've got the kid who thinks that all Mexicans are terrible people because he has a limited view of Mexicans. You have in the faked the made up scenario that I tried to work with, and hopefully it went well, with a man and a woman, where maybe he says something that's sexist, but that's not really where his heart actually is. He's not really a sexist. He was just trying to be hurtful because he came home. He was having a bad day. His wife was having a bad day. She gave him a hard time. And then he said something in response because that's how people tend to behave, right? When we get upset with somebody, hurt people, right? If I'm hurt by somebody else, I want to say something biting back to them. And if you have any doubts about this, get on Twitter and just look around. It's all over. And it happens like to everybody. So I think it's behoove us to recognize this. All right. So let's get into some other information here. I think that was where'd my mouse go? Here we are. Let's take a look and see what else we got, because we want to get through this. And did I play the second clip? No, let's play the second clip here. I'm going to be running a little bit behind, but I think we can make this happen.
I would just say off the bat, I do not accept that definitions can just mutate. That is something that I could debate that on, like the definition of a woman. I mean, and I'm saying not just about Jewish people. I think that we have to have a concrete definition to work with, because then you can just update and say, actually, I've changed that, and now this is what constitutes anti-Semitism.
But Candace, that is the horror of anti-Semitism. So what you are saying to me is that anti-Semitism is this and does not change. What I am saying to you is that the entire world and scholars about anti-Semitism recognize that it is a unique hate. That if you define it as that Jews should not be able to exist collectively, okay, as a collective, they shouldn't have that right. That changes from the Middle Ages with religion, the 18th through 20th centuries about race, and then after Israel's created, it's a hatred based on the nation. And until that is understood, that it is, this isn't something that's really questioned about among academics, theologians, Jewish scholars. I'm not presenting it. This is why I thought that I'm so optimistic about a dialogue. But I think a part of it is you view that the hate can't mutate. And what I'm trying to tell you is that we have 2,000 years of history that demonstrate the exact opposite.
Okay, so let's unpack that. What he's saying is that people have not changed. So let me offer a little pushback on that. There's an interesting article written by a man named Alan Brownfield, and it came out of the I'm gonna read some excerpts of it, but it comes out of the Journal of Palestine Studies in the spring of 1987. So this is a relatively old article. This is what I mean when I say I like to go back and find some old stuff. So let me put this up on the screen so that you can see it. And then let's see here. Is that the right one? Why are we not? Let's see here. Okay, so that's hello. There we go. And I don't know why. Oh, here. How about we add me to the screen as well? All right. So there we are. So it's this is titled Anti-Semitism, It's Changing Meaning. And let's skip down here. I'm going to try to go through this a little quickly because I'm behind today. Today, more and more anti-Semitism has been redefined as anything that opposes the policies and interests of the state of Israel. I'll remind you, this was written in 1987. We're in 2024. One cannot be critical of the Israeli prime minister concerned about the question of the Palestinians or dubious about the virtue of massive infusions of U.S. aid to Israel without subjecting oneself to the possibility of being called anti-Semitic. Every one of those things takes place today. If you say, hey, I think that Israeli bombing campaign in Gaza has gone too far, you are considered anti-Semitic. If you suggest that we should not have so much U.S. aid going to Israel, anti-Semitic. Who is it? Congressman Thomas Massey came under fire by AIPAC for that very reason. He said, I'm not voting for this bill because it gives so much money to Israel, and we don't need to be giving this money to Israel. AIPAC came out and they said, well, what an anti-Semite. Right. Like, and this was written in 1987. One of the first manifestations of this redefinition may be found in the book, The New Anti-Semitism by Arnold Foster and Benjamin R. Epstein, leaders of the Anti-Defamation League of, and I don't know if I'm going to say this right, B'nai B'rith. The authors begin by noting the apparent decrease in anti-Semitism in the years following World War II, especially following the Allied liberation of the concentration camps and the discovery of the full extent of Nazi atrocities. However, they maintain that this is only a superficial development. Anti-Semitism may remain dormant for years unless rooted out completely. It may grow again and this is they're quoting, of all the ills of the world, anti-Semitism is the least likely to die a natural death, end quote, they contend. What's very interesting is that when you go and read, and you can look back at some of my past podcasts, I believe the podcast where I reviewed the book White Fragility, it says the same thing about racism. It talks about how racism just keeps sprouting up somewhere, no matter what. So let's continue reading. Let me look at my notes here. Okay, yeah. So, thus, the nature of the new anti-Semitism, according to Forster and Epstein, is not necessarily hostility toward Jews as Jews or toward Judaism, but instead criticism of Israel and its policies. They justify their equation of anti-Semitism and political opposition to Israel on the grounds of Israel's importance to Jews and Jewish perceptions of Israel's centrality to their survival and security. Any criticism of Israel then becomes an attack on the Jews as Jews. Now, that's exactly what is happening today. And according to Rabbi Barclay, we're not allowed to criticize, we're not allowed to push back and say, no, I'm not being anti-Semitic. I'm only criticizing Israel because I think what's going on here, this particular policy, is excessive and out of line. But we can't do that because the definition is so broad and it includes everything. And it has included everything because, again, this was written in 1987. So this is not something that was written 2 years ago. This was written, when I was like 10 years old. All right. So if we continue on, what's my next page? Let's see. And I'm going to try to kind of go through this quickly here. All right. So we'll go down here. There's a whole lot in here. I will link it and you can read the article for yourself. The tactic of using the term anti-Semitism as a weapon against dissenters from Israeli policy is not new. So in 1987, they said, this is not even a new thing. Like, this is old. So here's very interesting. Dorothy Thompson, the distinguished journalist who was one of the earliest enemies of Nazism, found herself criticizing the policies of Israel shortly after its creation. Despite her valiant crusade against Hitler, she too was subject to the charge of anti-Semitism. In a letter to the Jewish newsletter in April of 1951, she wrote this: really, I think continued emphasis should be put upon the extreme damage to the Jewish community of branding people like myself as anti-Semitic. The state of Israel has got to learn to live in the same atmosphere of free criticism which every other state in the world must endure. There are many subjects on which writers in this country are, because of these pressures, becoming craven and mealy-mouthed. But people don't like to be craven and mealy-mouthed. Every time one yields to such pressure, one is filled with self-contempt, and this self-contempt works it out in resentment of those who caused it. So in other words, she's saying, like, look, When you criticize people, you force them into a spot where they don't want to be. And then they have a bit of contempt, self-contempt for having been forced into that, that turns into resentment at the people that pushed them there. So she's saying, if you're a journalist and you're trying to make criticism of Israeli policies and people are calling you anti-Semitic, you might shut up, but now you're going to have a resentment toward the people that are doing this, who probably are going to be Jewish. So she's saying it breeds anti-Jewish sentiments because it forces people to not be permitted to criticize in a way where you're distinguishing between all Jews and maybe this Israeli policy that we don't like. Now, she wrote this in 1951, 75 years ago. 75, about 75 years, about 75 years ago, she wrote that we weren't able to criticize Israel. In recent years, the charge of anti-Semitism the use of the charge of anti-Semitism to silence criticism and dissent has escalated. In November 1982, 3 rabbis held a rabbinical court at a Holiday Inn in Tewksbury, Massachusetts, and excommunicated a number of important Jews, including several rabbis, because they signed an advertisement criticizing Israel's invasion of Lebanon. Author and journalist I.F. Stone states that, quote, any Jew who says a nice word about Arabs or peace is supposed to be having an identity crisis or be self-hating. Now, I didn't play the clip, but Rabbi Barclay does label people as self-hating. So like this, all of this, none of this is actually new. This is all old, and it's following the same pattern. You criticize Israel for anything, even though the definition says that you can criticize Israel along with other nations, even though it says that you can, as long as it's similar criticism, what has actually happened is you can't, which is the same thing that happens when we look at when we look at racism or any other thing. People will say, well, yeah, there's criticisms that can be had, maybe not by you, and maybe you can criticize this or that. They might agree to it like on paper, but what ends up happening is in practice, because these definitions are so broad, people get away with, nope, nope, you're a transphobe. You're a racist. You're a bigot. You're anti-Semitic. So I think Candace Owens is right in challenging this. Now, whether or not she'll be able to be successful is another matter. I had some more material, but in the interest of time and making sure that I get my son there, I'm just gonna kind of read this one last thing. So there was an interesting, it's called, it was an interesting article that was published in 2022. What is wrong with the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism? And I'll put this up on the screen and then we'll go ahead and close it from there. So let's see here. There we go. All right. So there it is up on the screen. And we're going to go to the very end here because they go through like sentence by sentence, word by word. It's pretty in depth, way more in depth than necessary for our purposes here. So let's read here in their conclusion. It says the IHRA's 4-line definition of anti-Semitism correctly states that hate towards Jews may be anti-Semitic, but is worded vaguely and inadequately in a way that opens the door to unfounded accusations of anti-Semitism and allows other instances to go unchallenged. However, the main problems lie with the examples that it provides of what it considers may serve as illustrations of anti-Semitism. 7 of the 11 examples explicitly refer to the state of Israel. Rather than being an instrument to promote tolerance, we have argued that the IHRA document can be misused for political goals unrelated to tackling anti-Semitism, notably to stigmatize and silence critics of the Israeli government's treatment of indigenous Palestinians, and we have shown that many pro-Israel advocates have been doing just this. And they list like example after example of where they believe that these kind of things have happened. So you can go ahead and read that. I will put it in the show notes, but I do need to close because unfortunately I started late. And so I have to make the show a bit brief. Now, I want you to think about something. No other people have this same problem. if we say, hey, look, there's racism against white people, name a country that you're not allowed to criticize that or that if you criticized them in the wrong way, it would be considered, racism toward white people. There isn't one. Same thing with Asians, right? We criticize China all day long, rightfully so. China has a lot of bad policies. Nobody ever says that's anti-Asian. Nobody ever says, okay, if we're criticizing India, that's also anti-Asian or anti-brown, since they would be a slightly different variant of Asians. Nobody says that of any country in Africa. If we criticize the policies in South Africa or Niger or Egypt or any of them, nobody comes back and says, you know what? That's anti-African. No other group of people is treated the same way. However, I'm not pointing out, this is not a the Jews are so bad. What this is saying is we're talking about the definition. The definition allows for activists to run rampant with accusations. It allows the activist to run rampant with accusations. That is the core problem. And as we saw from Dorothy Thompson, this will actually breed more hatred. Because if we cannot have the debate about when a person that's part of a group is doing something wrong, or when maybe a group collectively is doing something wrong. So in this particular case, we might say Israel, the government, which is somewhat of a collective of people. If we cannot point out that there are problems with an individual or with a group, or at least a part of a group, then we cannot come to a consensus where we all agree on specific behaviors. Because what ends up happening is that group is exempt. And only that group gets to criticize them. Except for we don't see that criticism. We don't really see a whole lot of the activists in the trans space saying, hey, look, I love my trans people and I think we got a lot of fighting to do for our rights, but I think you guys took it too far. You don't see that happen. You don't see it really happen as so well with the Black community. And I mean, you do see it. And when you see it, the activists who are basically running the show, they slander every one of those people, right? In the Black community, if you are a conservative and you're like, look, us Black folk need to change and need to do this and need to do that, a lot of people will go, wait a minute, you can't say that because you're just kowtowing to the white man, Uncle Tom, right? Like that's the kind of thing that happens. If you're a Jewish person who says, you know what, I'm a Jew through and through, I love my Jewish people, but I think Israel's wrong on this, people like Rabbi Barclay will come along and say, you're being anti-Semitic or you're being self-hating, right? And this has existed. The only way for our society to come together as a cohesive unit of different people is for everybody to be subject to being criticized and then having debate on that criticism. And sometimes the criticism will be legitimate and sometimes it won't. But we have to have that debate. And when you take it off the table, when you say only, and what Rabbi Barclay did, he actually narrowed it down. He didn't even just say, if you paid attention, he didn't just say only Jews get to determine it. In his argument, you might be better off listening to the whole episode. He said Jews, and then he narrows it down to rabbis and intellectuals, and so he's not even talking about regular Jews. He's just talking about like all these really, really smart Jews, all the ones that have authority. They're the ones that decided, and anybody else who opposes it, well, you're just self-hating. So he narrows it down even further. And guess what? Same thing happens with every other group. Oh, you're not an activist in this space. What books have you written? Who are you? Right. So we have basically said the people that get to define slurs are the elites who have an interest in that slur being important. Those are the people. All right, folks, I got to end this show. I want to thank you for watching. I hope you found this episode informative and inspiring. I want you to be sure to catch me Monday through Friday, 7 a.m. ish. I really am working on trying to get it at 7 a.m. for an informed discussion on politics and culture. If you are subscribed to my YouTube, make sure you're subscribed to my YouTube channel, or if you prefer, subscribe to my Rumble channel. You can go to youtube.libertydad.com or rumble.libertydad.com. Let me know how I'm doing by leaving a comment while you're there. Last but not least, I want you to remember, if you're a champion of liberty, your business is people and your product is liberty. I want you to have a great week. Catch you next time. But for now, I'm out.